My name is David Chen, and in August 1969, I was a 22-year-old college dropout from San Francisco who thought I had found the love of my life in a free-spirited woman named Rainbow Moonchild, or at least, that's what she told me her name was. I had met her 3 months earlier at a poetry reading in Greenwich Village, where her flowing auburn hair, ethereal beauty, and passionate recitations about peace and love had completely captivated me. She seemed to embody everything the counterculture movement represented: freedom from conventional social constraints, spiritual awakening, and authentic living, unburdened by material possessions or traditional expectations. When she mentioned that she was planning to attend the Woodstock Music Festival, I immediately volunteered to drive her there, imagining 3 days of music, love, and deeper connection with the woman I was already planning to marry. What I discovered instead would shatter not only my romantic illusions, but my faith in the peace and love movement itself, as I learned that the woman I thought I knew was actually someone else entirely, someone who was already married to a man she had never mentioned and living a completely different life from the one she had shared with me. I had fallen hard for Rainbow during those magical spring months in New York, when she would appear at my apartment unannounced with flowers in her hair and stories about spiritual revelations she had experienced during meditation or drug experiences. She spoke in the mystical language of the hippie movement, describing how the universe was guiding her toward higher consciousness and how conventional society was a prison that trapped people in meaningless material pursuits. "David, darling," she would say in her slightly affected voice that I found enchanting, "we're living in a time of cosmic awakening when the old rules no longer apply. Love is the only truth that matters, and love can't be contained by bourgeois concepts like monogamy or permanence." Our relationship had been intense but sporadic, with Rainbow disappearing for days or weeks at a time to attend spiritual retreats, consciousness-raising gatherings, or music festivals throughout the Northeast. She would return with tales of transcendent experiences and deepened awareness, always maintaining that her absences were necessary for her spiritual growth and that true love meant supporting each other's individual journeys toward enlightenment. "I can't be possessed by anyone, even someone I love," she explained, when I occasionally expressed frustration with her unpredictable schedule. "The moment love becomes possession, it stops being love and becomes fear. I need to know that you trust me enough to let me be free." Her commitment to attending Woodstock had seemed like the perfect opportunity for us to share a transformative experience together, and I had eagerly volunteered to drive her to the festival in my Volkswagen van. The 3-day event was being promoted as a gathering of the tribes, a celebration of peace and music that would demonstrate the power of the love generation to create an alternative to the violence and materialism that characterized mainstream American society. "This is going to be historic, David," Rainbow told me as we planned our trip. 500,000 beautiful souls coming together to prove that love is stronger than hate, that music can heal the world, and that our generation can create the paradise that our parents' generation destroyed. The drive from New York City to Bethel should have been one of the most romantic journeys of my life, but I began to notice troubling inconsistencies in Rainbow's stories about her background and her plans for the future. When I asked about her family, she gave vague and contradictory answers about growing up in various locations with different relatives. Her knowledge of spiritual practices and Eastern philosophy seemed superficial, despite her claims of deep study and meditation experience. Most concerning of all, she seemed nervous and evasive when I suggested we should find ways to spend more time together after the festival, always deflecting conversations about long-term plans or commitment. "David, you're thinking too conventionally again," she would say whenever I tried to discuss our relationship seriously. "The future is an illusion, created by minds that can't live fully in the present moment. All we have is now, this experience, this love that we're sharing right here in this magical time. Why do you want to trap that energy in plans and promises that will only limit its natural flow?" Her words sounded wise and spiritually advanced, but they left me feeling confused and somehow diminished for wanting the security of knowing where our relationship was heading. The festival grounds at Woodstock were everything we had been promised, and more. A massive gathering of young people who had come from across the country to celebrate music, peace, and the possibility of creating a better world through love and consciousness expansion. The energy was electric as we set up our sleeping bags near other couples and groups who were sharing food, stories, and substances in a spirit of communal generosity. Rainbow seemed to blossom in this environment, dancing freely to the music, engaging in deep conversations with strangers, and radiating the kind of authentic joy that had first attracted me to her. For the first day and a half, everything was perfect. We listened to incredible music, participated in the spontaneous community that was emerging among the festival goers, and experienced the kind of connection that made me believe we were indeed part of a generation that was changing the world through love. Rainbow was affectionate and present in ways that she had never been during our time in New York, and I began to hope that the festival experience was bringing us closer together and helping her overcome whatever fears had been keeping her emotionally distant. The moment that changed everything occurred on the second afternoon, when I was waiting in line for food while Rainbow was somewhere in the crowd, probably dancing or talking with other festival goers. A man approached me, looked at me with obvious confusion, and said, "Excuse me, but aren't you here with Susan? I thought I saw her with you earlier." When I explained that I didn't know anyone named Susan, he described a woman who sounded exactly like Rainbow, but using a completely different name. "That's weird," he said, "because Susan Morrison is my neighbor back in Connecticut, and she definitely came here with her husband Tom. Maybe it's just someone who looks like her." The seed of doubt that conversation planted in my mind grew throughout the afternoon as I began to pay closer attention to Rainbow's interactions with other festival goers. Several people seemed to recognize her, but appeared confused when she introduced herself to them as Rainbow Moonchild, as if they knew her by a different name. When I casually asked her about it, she laughed it off, explaining that many people in the movement adopted multiple spiritual names as they evolved through different phases of their consciousness development. "Names are just labels, David," she said. "The real question is whether you're going to let paranoid thoughts destroy the beautiful connection we're sharing here." Before you continue this incredible journey of discovery, heartbreak, and personal growth with us, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about the people who learned life's hardest lessons through love, loss, and the search for authentic truth. By the evening of the second day, I couldn't ignore the growing evidence that Rainbow was not who she claimed to be. Too many people seemed to know her by different names. Her stories about her background kept changing, and she was becoming increasingly nervous whenever I tried to engage her in conversations about our past or future together. When I suggested we take a walk together away from the crowd so we could talk privately, she made excuses about wanting to hear specific musical performances or needing to connect with friends she had spotted in the audience. The confrontation that would reveal the truth came on the morning of the third day, when I woke up to find Rainbow's sleeping bag empty and her belongings missing. Panic set in as I searched the festival grounds, asking other attendees if they had seen her and describing her appearance and the name she had given me. After hours of frantic searching, a woman in our camping area approached me with a sympathetic expression and said, "Are you looking for Susan Morrison? Because if you are, I saw her leave early this morning with a tall guy with long brown hair. They were loading their stuff into a blue van with Connecticut plates." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The woman I'd been calling Rainbow Moonchild was apparently named Susan Morrison, and the tall guy with long brown hair sounded nothing like any friend she had ever mentioned to me. When I asked the woman how she knew about Susan, she explained that she lived in the same Connecticut town and had been surprised to see Susan at the festival since she knew Susan was married and had never seemed interested in the hippie scene. "I don't want to be the bearer of bad news," she said gently, "but Susan Morrison has been married to Tom Morrison for about 2 years. They live in a nice suburban house, and Tom works at an insurance company. I think Susan's been experimenting with the hippie lifestyle on weekends and vacations, but it's definitely not her real life. I'm sorry, I can see this is devastating news for you." The emotional impact of learning that the woman I loved was not only living a double life, but was married to someone else was overwhelming. Everything about our relationship had been based on lies: her name, her background, her spiritual commitments, and most importantly, her availability to build a future with me. The Rainbow Moonchild I had fallen in love with was apparently a weekend persona that Susan Morrison adopted when she wanted to escape from her conventional married life and experience the excitement of the counterculture movement without actually committing to its values or lifestyle. The hours that followed my discovery of Rainbow's true identity were among the darkest of my young life, as I struggled to process not only the betrayal I had experienced, but the implications of what I had learned about authenticity and deception within the peace and love movement. I spent the rest of that morning wandering through the festival grounds in a daze, watching other couples share intimate moments and wondering how many of them might also be living lies or playing roles rather than expressing their authentic selves. The irony was devastating. I had come to Woodstock believing it represented everything genuine and truthful about our generation's rejection of the hypocritical values of mainstream society, only to discover that I had been deceived by someone who was using the movement's ideals of free love and spiritual seeking as cover for an extramarital affair. The woman who had lectured me about the importance of living authentically and rejecting bourgeois conventions was apparently living the most conventional life imaginable while using me as an escape from her suburban responsibilities. My attempts to track down Susan Rainbow and confront her about the deception proved futile, as she had apparently left the festival with her husband and returned to whatever life she was living in Connecticut. The few people who admitted to knowing her by her real name were reluctant to provide details about her background or whereabouts, perhaps out of loyalty to her or discomfort with becoming involved in someone else's relationship drama. "Look, man," one guy told me when I pressed him for information, "people come to these festivals to get away from their regular lives. Maybe it's better if you just let this go and focus on the positive experiences you had together." The drive back to New York was a nightmare of self-doubt, anger, and crushing disappointment as I replayed every conversation I had shared with Rainbow, looking for clues I had missed and trying to understand how I could have been so completely deceived. Every sweet word she had spoken about love and consciousness seemed poisoned by the knowledge that she had been manipulating me while maintaining a secret marriage to someone else. The spiritual insights she had shared, the passionate moments we had experienced, even her criticism of conventional society, all of it now seemed like calculated performance rather than authentic expression. The return to my apartment in Greenwich Village was almost unbearable, as every corner reminded me of times Rainbow had visited, and every possession seemed contaminated by memories that I now knew were based on lies. The books on Eastern philosophy she had recommended, the records of spiritual music we had listened to together, even the meditation cushions she had encouraged me to buy, everything connected to our relationship now felt like evidence of my gullibility rather than shared growth toward higher consciousness. The process of investigating Susan Morrison's real identity became an obsession during the weeks following Woodstock, as I used what few clues I had to piece together the truth about the woman who had deceived me so completely. Through phone directories, local newspapers, and eventually a private investigator I hired with money borrowed from my parents, I gradually assembled a picture of Susan Morrison's actual life that bore no resemblance to the free-spirited hippie persona she had presented to me. Susan Morrison was indeed married to Tom Morrison, an insurance adjuster who lived in Stamford, Connecticut. They owned a modest suburban home, drove conventional cars, and by all appearances lived the kind of middle-class lifestyle that Rainbow had claimed to despise. Susan worked part-time as a secretary at a real estate office and had no apparent involvement with the counterculture movement except for her weekend excursions to festivals and gatherings where she adopted her alternative identity. The depth of her deception became clear when I learned that she had been using the Rainbow Moonchild persona for at least 2 years, maintaining relationships with multiple men in different cities who all believed they were involved with a free-spirited single woman exploring alternative lifestyles. According to the private investigator, I was just one of several men who had been deceived by her elaborate double life, each of us believing we were special while she rotated between different identities and locations to avoid detection. "Mr. Chen," the investigator told me when he delivered his final report, "I've seen cases like this before. Some people use the hippie movement as an opportunity to live out fantasies and experiment with behaviors they can't pursue in their regular lives. They adopt alternative identities that allow them to be irresponsible and deceptive while claiming they're pursuing higher consciousness and spiritual growth. It's a sophisticated form of manipulation that preys on people's idealism and trust." The emotional processing of this betrayal required me to examine not only my own naivety, but the broader questions about authenticity and deception that seemed to plague the counterculture movement. If someone could so easily adopt the language and appearance of spiritual seeking while living a completely conventional life, what did that say about the movement's claims to represent genuine alternative values? How many other people were using peace and love rhetoric to justify selfish and harmful behavior? The support I received from friends within the Greenwich Village community was mixed, with some expressing sympathy for my situation, while others seemed to blame me for expecting monogamy. And honesty from a relationship that had been explicitly based on free love principles. "David, you were trying to impose straight expectations on a hip relationship," one friend lectured me. "The whole point of free love is that you don't own other people or expect them to live their lives according to your conventional values. Maybe the lesson here is that you need to evolve beyond possessive thinking." These responses from people I had considered friends and allies added another layer of pain to my experience, as I realized that the counterculture community could be just as judgmental and unsympathetic as mainstream society, just in different ways. The movement that claimed to value honesty and authentic relationship had room to excuse deception and betrayal as long as it was framed in terms of spiritual growth and freedom from conventional constraints. The gradual process of healing from Susan's betrayal required me to rebuild my understanding of love, trust, and authenticity from the ground up. I had to learn to distinguish between genuine spiritual seeking and performance, between authentic alternative values and convenient excuses for irresponsible behavior, between real intimacy and skillful manipulation. The hardest part, I wrote in my journal during this period, is that she wasn't just lying about who she was lying about what love could be. She used the language of higher consciousness to justify lower behavior. The investigation into Susan's deception had revealed a network of other men who had been similarly deceived, and I made contact with several of them to compare experiences and try to understand the scope of her manipulations. Each of us had believed we were in a unique relationship with an extraordinary woman, only to discover that we were interchangeable components in an elaborate system of deception that had allowed her to experience the excitement of multiple relationships while maintaining the security of her marriage. "She told each of us exactly what we wanted to hear," observed Michael, a musician from Boston who had been involved with Susan Rainbow for almost a year. "She researched our interests and reflected them back to us so perfectly that we thought we had found our soulmate, but it was all calculated manipulation designed to make us fall in love with a person who didn't actually exist." The legal implications of Susan's behavior were complex, as her deceptions had been emotional rather than financial, and had occurred within the context of relationships that were supposed to be based on freedom and non-commitment. While what she had done was morally reprehensible, it wasn't clearly illegal, leaving her victims with little recourse except the satisfaction of exposing her behavior to others who might be vulnerable to similar manipulation. The decision about whether to confront Susan directly or simply move on with my life was one of the most difficult I had ever faced. Part of me wanted revenge, wanted to expose her deceptions to her husband and destroy the comfortable suburban life she had been protecting through her lies. But another part of me recognized that pursuing that path would only perpetuate the cycle of hurt and might cause additional harm to innocent people who had been unaware of her double life. The resolution I ultimately chose involved confronting Susan Morrison directly, not for revenge, but for closure and understanding. After weeks of internal debate, I decided that I needed to hear her explanation for the deceptions and betrayals, even if that explanation proved unsatisfactory or self-serving. Using the address my private investigator had provided, I drove to Stamford, Connecticut on a cold October morning to have the conversation that would finally allow me to put this chapter of my life behind me. The suburban neighborhood where Susan lived was everything she had claimed to reject during our time together: manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, and the kind of material comfort that she had supposedly transcended through spiritual awakening. Her house was a modest but well-maintained colonial with a carefully tended garden and a new Buick sedan in the driveway. Standing on her front porch, I felt like I was visiting a stranger rather than confronting someone who had claimed to love me. Susan's reaction when she opened the door and saw me standing there was a mixture of shock, fear, and what might have been relief that her deceptions had finally been discovered. Gone was the flowing hair and hippie attire that had characterized her rainbow moonchild persona, replaced by a conservative dress and hairstyle that made her look like any other suburban housewife. "David," she said quietly, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "What are you doing here? You can't be here." "My husband will be home soon." The conversation that followed took place in her kitchen, with Susan sitting across from me at a table that seemed to symbolize everything conventional and mundane about the life she had been hiding from me. Her explanations for her behavior were exactly what I had expected, a mixture of self-justification, victim positioning, and pseudo-spiritual rationalization, that attempted to frame her deceptions as a form of personal growth and consciousness expansion. "David, you have to understand that I never meant to hurt you," she began, her voice carrying none of the mystical confidence that had characterized her rainbow persona. "I was going through a spiritual crisis, trying to figure out who I really was beneath all the expectations that society had placed on me. The person you knew as Rainbow was a part of me that I was exploring, a potential self that I was trying to understand. It wasn't meant to be permanent or exclusive. It was an experiment in authenticity." Her words were carefully chosen, but ultimately hollow, revealing someone who had learned to use the language of spiritual seeking to avoid taking responsibility for the harm she had caused. When I pointed out that her experiment in authenticity had been based entirely on lies and had caused real pain to real people, she responded with more psychological jargon about the need to transcend conventional moral categories in order to achieve higher consciousness. "You're still thinking in terms of right and wrong, David," she said, echoing the kind of spiritual superiority she had often displayed during our relationship. "But awakened consciousness operates beyond those dualistic concepts. I was following my authentic impulses toward love and connection, even if that meant challenging society's narrow definitions of appropriate behavior. The pain you're experiencing is coming from your attachment to possessing me rather than celebrating the beautiful connection we shared." The most devastating aspect of our confrontation was not her refusal to accept responsibility for her deceptions, but her apparent inability to understand why those deceptions had been harmful. She seemed genuinely puzzled by my anger and hurt, as if her adoption of counterculture values had exempted her from basic requirements of honesty and consideration for others. The woman who had lectured me about authentic living had been living the most inauthentic existence imaginable while convincing herself that her sophistical rationalizations represented spiritual advancement. "Susan," I finally said, using her real name deliberately, "you weren't exploring consciousness or authenticity. You were using other people's idealism and trust to fulfill your own selfish desires while avoiding the consequences of your choices. You took everything beautiful about the peace and love movement and turned it into a cover story for betrayal and manipulation. That's not spiritual evolution. That's spiritual corruption." Her response revealed the final layer of her self-deception. She actually believed that her behavior had been justified by the counterculture movement's rejection of conventional morality, that free love meant freedom from honesty and commitment, and that spiritual seeking exempted her from basic human decency. "David, you're imposing straight values on a hip relationship," she said, unconsciously echoing the criticism I had received from some of my friends in Greenwich Village. "The whole point of consciousness expansion is moving beyond the limitations of bourgeois morality into higher forms of love that aren't constrained by possessiveness and jealousy." The encounter ended with my realization that Susan Morrison would never acknowledge the harm she had caused or demonstrate genuine remorse for her deceptions. She had constructed an elaborate psychological and spiritual framework that allowed her to justify any behavior as long as it could be framed in terms of personal growth or consciousness expansion. The Rainbow Moonchild persona had been just one expression of a fundamentally narcissistic personality that used spiritual language to avoid taking responsibility for its impact on others. The drive back to New York was surprisingly liberating, as I finally understood that the woman I had loved had never actually existed except in my imagination and her skillful performance. The real Susan Morrison was someone I could never have loved, a manipulative, self-absorbed person who used other people's idealism to fulfill her own desires while maintaining the comfortable suburban life she was unwilling to sacrifice for her supposed spiritual convictions. The broader implications of my experience with Susan extended far beyond personal betrayal to questions about authenticity and deception within the counterculture movement itself. If someone could so easily adopt the language and appearance of spiritual seeking while living a completely contrary reality, what did that say about the movement's ability to distinguish between genuine transformation and sophisticated performance? How many other people were using peace and love rhetoric to justify fundamentally selfish and harmful behavior? The process of rebuilding my life after the Susan Morrison disaster required me to develop new criteria for evaluating authenticity in relationships and spiritual communities. I learned to look for consistency between people's words and actions, to value sustained commitment over dramatic gestures, and to be skeptical of anyone who used spiritual language to excuse behavior that would be considered unethical in any moral framework. The year that followed my discovery of Susan's deceptions was a period of profound personal growth as I learned to distinguish between genuine spiritual seeking and self-serving manipulation. I became involved with more grounded spiritual communities that emphasize service to others rather than personal gratification, and I developed relationships with people whose commitment to alternative values was demonstrated through their daily choices rather than their weekend personas. The woman I eventually married was someone I met at a community garden in Brooklyn, where she was volunteering her time to help provide fresh food for low-income families. Unlike Susan's dramatic spiritual pronouncements, Mary's commitment to alternative values was expressed through quiet, consistent actions that improved other people's lives. "I don't talk much about consciousness expansion," she told me during one of our early conversations, "but I think the best way to expand consciousness is to expand compassion, and the best way to expand compassion is to do things that actually help people." The lesson I learned from following my girlfriend to Woodstock and discovering she was already married was ultimately about the difference between authentic transformation and sophisticated deception, between genuine spiritual seeking and convenient rationalization. The counterculture movement had created new possibilities for human connection and consciousness development, but it had also created new opportunities for people to exploit others' idealism and trust. My experience with Susan Morrison taught me that the most important spiritual practice is rigorous honesty. Honesty about our motivations, our commitments, and our impact on others. The peace and love movement had correctly identified the limitations of conventional morality, but some people had mistakenly concluded that rejecting conventional values meant rejecting all values rather than developing more sophisticated and compassionate ethical frameworks. Looking back on that painful summer of 1969, I'm grateful for the hard lessons I learned about love, trust, and authenticity. The betrayal I experienced forced me to develop discrimination and wisdom that have served me well throughout my life, helping me build relationships based on genuine compatibility rather than romantic fantasy, and choose spiritual communities that emphasize character development rather than just consciousness expansion. The woman who called herself Rainbow Moonchild taught me that the most dangerous lies are those that contain just enough truth to be believable, and that the most harmful deceptions are those that exploit our highest aspirations and deepest longings. But she also taught me that surviving betrayal and rebuilding from deception can lead to stronger, more authentic relationships if we learn the right lessons from our experience. In the end, following my girlfriend to Woodstock and discovering she was already married was one of the most painful but ultimately valuable experiences of my young life, forcing me to grow up in ways that might have taken years to achieve through easier circumstances. The love I thought I had lost turned out to be an illusion, but the wisdom I gained was real and lasting.